Europe in 2020, imagining what world we'll inhabit, what our continent will look like in 10 years' time, is at the heart of the strategy just published by the European Commission called Europe 2020. A successor to the Lisbon strategy, a strategy written 10 years ago at a time when the Twin Towers were still standing, when climate change barely registered on the political agenda, when the dot-com bubble was still booming. We know that a lot can happen in 10 years. Europe 2020 sets out a strategy based on our common core beliefs in a social market, in competitive place in the global economy, and in a sustainable development path able to pass on a world to our children and grandchildren that we'd be proud for them to inherit. To talk about Europe 2020 and what it means for us all, and particularly for the European Social Fund, we're delighted to have with us PeterStubjorgensen, Director in DG Employment and Social Affairs in the European Commission. Thank you very much for giving us your time today. Can I start by asking you about the project visit that you've done today, I think, to a project in Rotherham, where you've seen ESF in action in England as it is now. How does what you've seen today illustrate some of the key themes in Europe 2020?
Well, the project that I visited was one where assistance is given to people who have lost a job, perhaps people who are very well or very ill prepared to go to look for another job because they have worked for the same employer for a very long time. They have perhaps no previous experience with going through job interviews, going through filling out of forms, presenting themselves, etc. So it's a very, very useful type of project in terms of getting people who are at risk of dropping out of the labour market a chance to get back into productive employment. And from what I saw today, and from what I heard from the participants in the course, this is highly successful and has a very good potential to be a successful reintroduction of people into employment. And in that sense, it has a lot to do with Europe 2020, which is a way of thinking of how Europe can get out of the crisis, how we can overcome the crisis, get back into growth, and set out a strategy for the longer term. That's why we call it EU 2020. And set some very clear principles for what it is we want to achieve and some achievable objectives for that strategy. It is a growth strategy which is based on three major principles. There is smart growth, that is, it is based on knowledge, information, and a modern competitive economy. It is a sustainable growth. It takes into account the needs of the climate, the environment, the sustainability of investments, and it is an inclusive growth, meaning we will not leave people behind. We will try as best we can to get everybody on board. And obviously, employment, the functioning of the labour market, the openness of the labour market to achieve high levels of employment is fundamental to a strategy like that. And that is what projects like the one in Rotherham and what the European Social Fund in general does. That's what it's all about.
Those three pillars of smart, sustainable and inclusive growth, some might argue there's a tension between achieving all of those things. Growth sometimes is at the expense of environmental concerns, or maintaining employment might be at the expense of innovative new industries. How's that tension going to be resolved in the strategy?
It's very clear that there is tension, I should say, between those different elements of the strategy. But all the elements are important and all the elements need to be there. The worst thing that can happen to Europe is that we do not have a clear idea where we want to be in 2020. I think you should see the strategy as one where we point out, where the Commission points out, the kind of Europe we would like to live in 2020, which is one where growth has been based on these principles, that the environment has been taken duly into account, that the climate challenge has been taken duly into account, and where employment rates are high and sustained for Europe as a whole. It's not a mathematical game of one member state growing quicker in one area, which is compensated by another member state growing a little bit quicker in a different area, or matching each other out on a sort of average basis. It's not about that. It is about identifying the type of Europe we would like to live in 20 years' time.
And in practical terms, how would you see the strategy being implemented? It now having been sort of set as a grand strategy, what happens now?
Now, the Commission has proposed that this be our overall strategy. This will be combined with a specific setting of objectives for how many people should be in employment, how many people should be, or how few people rather, should be at risk of poverty, how much research and development efforts, etc., should be set. There are 5 very clear targets to be set, and then there are 7 flagship projects, flagship initiatives, where we will define more in detail how this is to come about, including in the labour market, for young people, for the competitiveness in a globalized society, where also, of course, the structural funds such as the Social Fund and the European Globalization Adjustment Fund will play their roles.
European Social Fund is mentioned within the strategy quite a number of times, particularly in relation to employment and the balance between supply and demand in the labour market and social inclusion. In many ways, that's the traditional arena of ESF. Is that going to continue in the context of the strategy? What sort of ways do you think ESF might change as a result?
Yes and no. The European Social Fund is, as you rightly point out, first and foremost, a labour market instrument. We invest in better qualifications, in better skills for the workforce, more adaptability of the workforce. And the main purpose of the social fund is, and will remain, because that is in the treaty, that it should facilitate the operations of the labour market in Europe as a whole. Therefore, the overall thrust of the fund remains the same, and it remains the very useful same as we have seen so far for the last many, many years. Delivery mechanisms is a different thing. As it is today, we deliver the European Social Fund money through what we call operational programs, agreed with the member states, managed by the member states, and co-financed between national resources and European resources from the Social Fund. And then there is a very elaborate system of controls and checks that the money end up where we have agreed that they should end up. Now, a system based on controls and checks is often a very cumbersome and administrative heavy system to operate. And we are looking into ways of improving the operation of the mechanisms that the social fund and indeed the other structural funds are using today. There are several possibilities. Nothing has been decided yet, but the specialists are working on different models to see if it's possible to reduce the bureaucracy and reduce the time it takes for us to agree actions before the actions are actually carried out. And a similar consideration is being done in the area of the European Globalization Adjustment Fund, which is a newer instrument, but which has a very complicated delivery mechanism as well.
I also noticed in the strategy there's reference to increasing labour mobility across the across the European labour market. Is that something you would see ESF beginning to contribute more to? Because I don't think it's done very much in that area before.
Yes, we have actually done quite a number of efforts to increase labour market mobility, and that has been through training and development of qualifications that makes it possible for people to move around in trades, but also physically move to another geographic location. We have seen quite a lot of increase in internal mobility in the labour market, but we are far from, say, American or similar mobility rates between states. The idea of having a mobile labour market is, of course, not new. It is underexploited as far as we can see, because with mobility comes better possibilities for the workers, but also for the companies, the employers, to better match supply and demand in the labor market. If you have closed shops, if you have closed narrow definitions of skills and qualifications, it becomes more difficult to have a labor market that will clear supply and demand. So that is the basic thinking behind the mobility parts of our new initiatives.
And there's also reference to innovation, to sharing of best practice, to peer review and so on. And that's always been quite a strong tradition in ESF, the sharing of best practice and trying to do things more broadly across Europe. And it's interesting to see that still there. From the Commission point of view, are there particular areas where you're anxious to see innovation, anxious to see new ideas being brought forward?
Well, we have some very good and quite recent experience with developing new approaches to opening the labour markets, particularly to groups which are either distant from the labour market or have their or are at the margins of the labour market. Their qualifications and backgrounds and lives do not exactly match what the labour market would normally expect of a worker. We had an initiative, a community initiative called Equal over the last programming period, which was intended to provide an open labour market opportunity to all groups of the population, whether they suffered from a handicap, physical, mental handicap, whether they were part of an ethnic minority, had language problems, were perhaps particularly vulnerable in terms of at poverty risk, ex-convicts coming out of prison and trying to find their place in the labour market. And from that experience, we have a number of best practices that can be put and are being put to very good use in the operational activities of the European Social Fund. And I, for one, would like to see that kind of experience exploited even further and perhaps even repeated and expanded in the next European Social Fund. This is something that will definitely go into the discussions on the new regulation.
So you feel that there's still a lot of room for new work, particularly in those sorts of areas around working with the hardest to reach?
I do believe that there's a need, and I do believe that we have some very good answers in this particular field. What I don't really think is necessary is a new definition of what the ESF can spend money on. I believe that with today's spending rules, which essentially say if it is possible to do this with national money, it should be possible to do with European money. That is enough for us in order to assure the necessary flexibility and the necessary controls and checks over expenditure. Mm-hmm. I don't think that there's anything major to be done in that area. But new thinking about how it can be done, to what extent you would like to prioritize certain activities over others, that is a discussion that never ends and can continue to be improved and improved in the sense of better activities of the European Social Fund.
Many people delivering ESF work in England perhaps don't have the links into the Commission, don't have opportunities to share their experience with others as much as they would like. If people have good ideas, if they've got a really brilliant way of doing something, how do they reach you? How do they reach the Commission and people in other member states?
Well, it's true that they perhaps do not have direct links to or contact in the European Commission. And one may, in a certain very large number of cases, ask why on earth should they? Because this is not where they will get the best partner for what they're actually doing. When I listen to, for example, the discussions between managing authorities and others who have experience and responsibility for management of European Social Fund monies, I feel that those are the real experts. These are the people who actually know how to put together a good activity in order to get an unemployed person from the situation of unemployment into a situation where he can or she can apply for a job and hold on to a job. What we do at European level is to organize and facilitate the exchange of experience. We have several networks established between the partners who have actual experience with execution of programs and activities. This is organized so that the managing authorities easily can contact each other, exchange best practices, learn from each other during or through such learning networks. Also, much of this happens electronically, so there are sites created where exchanges can take place and where you can find good ideas. The Equal site is one such, but only one such way of exchanging. What we try to do at the European Commission level is to make sure, to the extent that we can, that the rules that there must be surrounding the actual use and spending of structural funds are as conducive to efficient management of funds as humanly possible, and certainly try to avoid, because that would be very easy for us to do, that the rules actually stop and hinder the application of the funds. It's very easy to say, it is extremely hard to do, but we're working on it.
You've been involved in ESF for quite some time, and you see a lot of work that goes on in other member states as well. Are there particular things that you think would be lessons for people working with the fund in England? Are there new things to be learned from other member states?
I am a firm believer in the exchange of best practices. There are ways in which, for example, people with slight handicaps are introduced into the labour market, say in Scandinavian countries, which can and should be used to inspire similar activities in other member states where there is less of a tradition or a different tradition for handling people with impediments in the labour market. There is a marked difference between the treatment of elderly workers between the member states, and where there are clearly elements, for example, of training possibilities and further qualifications, even at a relatively old age, which are pursued in some member states and not in others. And I believe very firmly that all the member states can benefit from having access to this kind of experience in the other member states. And the number of examples that can be mentioned here is really staggering. If I could give another example, one of the real obstacles to, for example, increasing female employment rates, which is part of an overall increase in the employment rate that we would like with the new strategy, is of course the availability of childcare facilities. But that is far from being the only problem facing families with children in a modern world. We have an example, and it's free for all to see on our websites, where the mayor of a medium-sized town in one of the member states decided to organize a meeting of the local authorities, the post office, the pharmacy, the schools, the shop owners, in fact a broad spectrum of people either supplying or services or goods in the local economy. And they sat down and they discussed opening hours. Why is it that you can only go to the doctor during working hours? And why is it that in order to get to fetch a recommended or a registered letter from the post office, you have to take an hour off in the middle of the day in order to go in? These kinds of incompatibilities were actually solved by having people sitting together and devising ways of matching opening hours with the needs of the clients and the possibilities of the suppliers. This has got nothing to do really with spending money. This has got really nothing to do with increasing people's qualifications or anything like that. This is a practical way of making it possible to make some choices that will bring the possibility of taking another job or better job, spending more time and better time on work, on family matters and on private matters.
So in a case like that, we need to think more broadly. It's not
Yes.
just about the job, it's the context that it takes place in.
And this is an example which has already received support from the European Social Fund. That's why we have it as one of our best practices or good practices for others to learn from, and it has been quite successful.
And where's the best place for people to go to find out about things like that?
There are many different places. If you are, say, a managing authority in a member state, and I know there are not that many, one of the very good places is, of course, to go to the Commission sites, especially for the managing authorities and especially for the Equal Programme. If you are somebody working with or in connection with a managing authority, for example, as provider or as co-financing organization, then ask your managing authority for the best links and the best places to look for further information. There's no single place which is the best for everybody, but there are a number of places that can be made available to everybody, including individuals who are interested in following what happens with structural fund and especially social fund money.
And we will put some of those links onto ESF Works afterwards to help facilitate that exchange. The strategy has just been published by the Commission. What happens now?
It has been proposed. This is now a proposal from the European Commission. It is being discussed, it will be discussed at the European Summit here in spring, where we expect and hope that the European Summit will endorse the elements of the strategy, the objectives of the strategy, and indeed the flagship projects, or flagship initiatives. Later in the year, the 7 flagship initiatives will be presented in a more concrete form and in a more elaborate form. But the European Council, so the Council of Heads of State and Government, will be the owner of this process, will have a direct control over the process and be the motor, the inspiration for the achievement of the process. So this is at extremely high level. But it has also got some very mundane and direct implication on the ground, because we're going to deploy all the different tools we have, not just the structural fund, but regulatory tools, tools related to exchange of information, building up of common knowledge. Everything is going to be thrown in activity to support and promote the strategy of Europe 2020. The budget review we must have because the present budget arrangements will expire in 2013, at the end of 2013. So the budget review becomes part of the, or rather becomes the European financing mechanisms to support the strategy. And therefore the budget review will be a very, very important element in establishing the foundations for the strategy. And that debate has already begun on the structure, and not least the size of the overall budget, and how it should be distributed on the instruments and on the policies that will support the strategy. So there is a clear link between the two, but we have now, with the Euro 2020, EU 2020 strategy, set out what we believe should be the objectives of the strategy. Then comes the very difficult discussion on the budgetary means to support the strategy.
So strategy first, then budget.
You need to know what you want to do, and then you can decide how you do it.
Yes, indeed. Looking back over the 10 years of the Lisbon strategy, which is coming to an end now, and all the challenges involved in trying to deliver that, the way the world has changed in so many ways since that was first set up, what do you think the greatest risks are in achieving the vision that's set out in Europe 2020?
Of course, it's always risky to set high and important goals. The risk, of course, is that you don't get to where you want to be. This, however, should not prevent you from setting and having high aspirations. I think the Lisbon goals were not only good and relevant, but very, very important to guide member states and the European institutions in the right direction. Now, we all know that the Lisbon strategy was not 100% successful. We did not reach all the detailed goals that we set out to do, but nobody have argued, and nobody can argue, that these objectives were wrong in any sense. And in a certain sense, the objective of creating growth with these three elements of that I mentioned before remain the same and remain important as guidelines, as yardsticks for the kind of society that we want to have in 2020. So the risk is, of course, that we do not go all the way and we do not reach the full goals. But there would be an even greater risk of losing complete direction if we did not set really ambitious and strong goals that could be understood by everybody.
And what are the best grounds for optimism?
Oh, I believe Europe has a lot of grounds for optimism. We have a pretty strong integration now of markets at many levels. We have a currency that works and has withstood enormous pressures. We have a lot of potential for further growth, in particular in the services sector. We have a rather well-educated and quite productive population. There are lots and lots of things that are working in favor of European growth, provided that we establish and agree common objectives for growth.
And at the centre of that, or one of the things at the centre, will still be the European Social Fund?
I hope so.